a main branch of our ritual in Jagannath Temple has been cut, and he referred to the main dance during the meal offering. That is why our rituals are no longer efficacious. They no longer give fruits. So it's a very sad statement, but it was a true statement. It's the end, and now it's the real end because all of the Maharis with whom I worked are now dead. So this is the end of a millenarium tradition, and I mourn its passing.
Ancient institution, which was on the vestiges of rapid decline at the time for fieldwork in the 1970s and 1980s, and subsequently died out at the time of my research in 2021. Under the colonial disciplining of deviant sexualities, together with post-colonial legislations, Devadasis were classified, categorized, conceptualized, and criminalized as religious prostitutes.
It's my honor and my delight to bring to you, the audience seated here, Dr. Frederick Apfel Marglin and Dr. Shriya Patnaik, who will be our speakers for today, on an amazing subject that not too many people research or even know about, the life and death of a very ancient female tantric institution, the Devadasis of Jagannath. And she is such a highly regarded, awarded scholar, Professor Emerita of Anthropology at Smith College, Massachusetts. Her groundbreaking research in Odisha began in 1975, focusing on the Devadasis, the Maharis of the Jagannath Temple in Puri. Her seminal book, Wives of the God King, through Oxford University Press in 1985, documented the complex ritual role of these women shortly before the institution vanished. She later co-edited Purity and Auspiciousness in Indian Society in 1985 and published further research on Odisha's Raja festival in Rhythms of Life in 2008. Exploring themes of menstruation, fertility, and feminine power in agricultural and rural life. And now, Dr. Shriya Patnaik. During her academic trajectory so far, Shriya has been closely involved in conducting archival, qualitative, and quantitative research for various data-driven projects, including Heidelberg University's Odisha Research Project, and the Odisha High Court and Judicial Archives. In addition to her scholarly interests, Shriya has also worked in the public policy and NGO sectors on gender and human rights projects across India, Switzerland, the US, and the UK. And these experiences have played a key role in shaping her research focus on women's rights and minority rights initiatives at a transnational scale. So with this, a very warm welcome to Frederick and Shriya, and over to you. The audience is eagerly waiting.
I'm going to start my talk with this painting of a very loved and well-known story in Odisha, Shriya Shringar, who was a ascetic who was born in the forest out of his father spilling his seed in a pond, and the doe drank it, and so he was born with a horn on his head. And what happened, the story is like that. In the nearby kingdom, there was a drought and there was famine because there was no rain. And the king was told that the only way he could bring the rain on is to have Shriya Shringar seduced by a Devadasi. And that's what the painting shows. Shriya Shringar is on a boat on his way to the kingdom, and on the boat is a dancing Mahari, and the ascetic is seduced by the Devadasi, and the rains come. So I start with this because this story really tells us that the the dance and the rituals of the Maharis have everything to do with the well-being of the whole kingdom, of people at large. So that's why I chose this story that really communicates this. So here are two pictures that I took at Konark that really shows that the key role of the Maharis in temples, both as musicians and also their activity. One of the slides is of a Maituna, and I will come back to the meaning of Maituna in the main ritual of Jagannath Temple. I took this slide because it was in the 70s. The king looked very young, he was, and in front of him, the two Rajgurus. The Rajgurus are the Purohit of the king and play a central role in the ritual of the Devadasis. So this slide, this is a plan of the Jagannath Temple compound. It came from the South India Heidelberg study that was done of the history of the Jagannath Temple before I arrived in Puri in 1975. And it was carried out by many very well-known scholars. And that is where I got this drawing, because as a non-Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain, I could never enter the temple. So in order to understand exactly where the Devadasi was situated during the main ritual of the day, I needed this sketch. So let me now focus on the main ritual, the day with the Maharis. It is called Raja Upacharo, which is a kingly, a royal ritual, and it takes place during the midday meal, the most important meal of the day in Jagannath Temple. And on that sketch, you can see on the lower, well, from my point of view, the lower left, there's a path to what is the main temple, the Bhogomandapa on the eastern side of the main temple. So these are the kitchen. So the main meal of the day is prepared and offered at that moment in the early afternoon. The second room in the main temple is the Nata Mandira, the dance hall. And at the eastern end of the dance hall, in the middle of it, is what is known as the pillar. And the Devadasi danced in front of the pillar. And after a lot of additional research, I was able to ascertain where she faces. And she dances along with the Rajguru, one of the Rajgurus, who stands there with a golden cane, a Sunabeta, during her dance. And the pakawaj, the drumming, is done by somebody from the brothers of the Maharis. So these are, and the direction of the dancer, of the Mahari, it turns out the Mahari faces south. This is south. This is east, west, north, south. The southern direction is the direction of the Smasana in Puri, the cremation ground, and it's also the direction where Rakshasas and bad things come from. So the dance with her facing south really captures that her dance protects the realm and the population in the realm and the land and everything from possible bad things coming from the southern direction. And the other thing about this ritual is, and this I was taught by Krishna Chandra Rajguru at the time, who was my teacher, one of my revered teacher, who explained to me that this Raja Upacharo is a Shakta ritual, a Tantric Shakta ritual, during which vegetarian versions of the 5 M's, the famous 5 M's, presented in the vegetarian form. And the 5th M, which is Maituna, namely sexual union, is the dance of the Devadasi. I'm emphasizing this. She's not even near the inner sanctum, which is on the western side of the main temple. So she's not dancing for the deities, clearly. She's dancing for the protection of people in general, the realm, the land, the fertility, all the auspicious things, and to prevent inauspicious happenings. The dance itself is the 5th offering, which is Maituna. We will see in the clip that we are showing a little later of a documentary I organized. So the Raja Upacharo, when the Mahari dances in the presence of the Rajguru in the Nata Mandira facing south, is a Tantric ritual. It's not the only ritual of the Maharis of the day. There are 2 rituals. The main one is the one I've been discussing and showing. So what happens is that in the kitchens here on the southern side, the corner of the east and the south, they bring not only the 5 M's in vegetarian form, by pandas who offer it in the Garbhagriha. And they also bring the food for the pilgrims. And this is a very, very public event. The food for the pilgrims is placed in the Bhogamandapa, which is right to the east, right next to the Nata Mandira. So the Devadasi dances between 2 food offering, the one in the Garbhagriha, the 5 M's, or the 4 food M's, and in the Bhogamandapa, the food for the pilgrims. And it's very well known that the temple of Jagannath transforms prasad into Mahaprasad. And this is what the pilgrims come. They come to witness the dance of the Mahari, and then they buy the Mahaprasad. So the dance, these 5 M's, and especially the dance, transforms prasad into Mahaprasad. And I've been told, now this, let me just say that this ritual stopped in 1955. This was a decision of the state of Odisha, and it never started again. It was the end of that ritual. And we will hear what Rajguru has to say a little later about that. But I've been told by persons who were older and had witnessed the dance that after the dance, the pilgrims that gather in the Nata Mandira would roll on the ground where the Mahari had danced in order to pick up on their body what they called Shakti Uchista, the leftovers of Shakti. At that moment, the dancer is, or she used to be, called Chalanti Devi, the living goddess, by the pilgrim pandas. That stopped in 1955. They no longer were called Chalanti Devi by the pilgrim pandas, and they lost their Inam lands, their tax-exempt lands that sustain them as temple temple servants. So 1955 is really a profound dividing line where the authorities, the political authorities, wanted this ritual to die, to be gone. There was a tremendous exit by the younger Maharis who no longer wanted to do this ritual. And so I interacted with 4 remaining Maharis. There were a few others, but they were not interested in talking to me. And those who talked to me, the 4 main ones, said that things changed drastically once this main ritual, this tantric ritual, was declared illegal, basically. That's what happened. And before that, the Maharis were worshipped by the pilgrims. They received gifts. They were sustained by their Inam lands, and they were respected. They were introduced by the pilgrim pandas as the Chalanti Devi, as the living goddess. All of this stopped. The other ritual of the Maharis that did not stop was the evening ritual, which was not public, and it was in front of the Garbhagruha, and it was the singing of songs in the style of the Gita Govinda. And Kokila Prabha, who was one of my main collaborators with whom I worked intensively, kept doing this throughout my time of fieldwork in Puri Jagannath. But that singing ritual was not a public event. It was private, in the close to the Garbhagruha, facing the Garbhagruha and facing the deities. So it was a Vaishnavite ritual, and there is a text, a plaque inside Jagannath Temple, I'm told, authored by Chaitanya himself, saying that this ritual has to take place daily. And Kokila Prabha continued doing it very faithfully. There were, of course, the Devadasi Maharis participated in other kinds of events around festivals. They had, for example, a big singing event during Ratha Jatra when the statue of Lakshmi, the wife of Jagannath, was brought out with the king, and the Devadasis sang the anger of Lakshmi as being left behind by her husband and sister-in-law and brother-in-law. And that was quite lengthy. I was there, I witnessed this, I recorded it. And also in other festivals, the Nobokolevoro, when the old images are replaced by new images, that happens every 12 to 14 years. And also Chandan Jatra and other festival, there are appearances of the Maharis. But the daily rituals, the big, public, important daily ritual in the Nata Mandira, that stopped in 1955. And it's very sad, in my view. It's extremely sad, but there we go. So that was really the end of this institution. And we will hear much more details by Dr. Shriya Patnaik, who's done excellent research, historical research on how this came about. Now, perhaps what I want to show is this clip to hear the voice of Krishna Chandra Rajguru about the loss of this ritual.
We do the human body. ଜଗନ୍ନାଥ ମନ୍ଦିରରେ ଶକ୍ତିଶାଳୀ ଲୋକ ପ୍ରକାର ସେବାକାରୀ ଅଛି। ତାକୁ ରଜା ମହାରାଜା ଆଉ ପ୍ରଶଂସ ଆଉ ପଣ୍ଡା ଅସ୍ପାଳକ ଯାହାକୁ ସିଙ୍ଗାଡ଼ି କୁହାଯାଏ, ଆଉ ଦଇତା ପାଳ ଗରୁ, ପତ୍ନୀ ଗରୁ, ବରା ଗରୁ, ଅନ୍ୟାନ୍ୟ ମାର୍ଗିକ ଏଭଳି ବହୁତ ପ୍ରକାର ଶକ୍ତିଶାଳୀ ଲୋକ ଅଛି। ତାକୁ ମାହାରି କହୁଛନ୍ତି। ଆମେ ଜଗନ୍ନାଥ ପ୍ରତିନିଧି ଯେଉଁ ମହାରାଜା ତାଙ୍କର ଆମେ ଗୁରୁ। ଆମେ ମନ୍ଦିରରେ ପରୀକ୍ଷକ ସେଇ ଯେଉଁ ମାହାରିମାନେ ନୃତ୍ୟକାରିଣୀ ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରକାର ଅଛନ୍ତି, ଗାଉଁଲି ମଧ୍ୟ ଗୋଟେ ପ୍ରକାର ଅଛି। ସେମାନେ ଗାଉଁଲିମାନେ ବର୍ଷା ସମୟରେ ଗାଆନ୍ତି। ନୃତ୍ୟକାରୀମାନେ ସକାଳୁ ଫେରା କଲା ବେଳେ ଆମ ଆଗରେ ନୃତ୍ୟ କରନ୍ତି। ଆମେ ସୁନାଗତ ଭଣ୍ଡାରକୁ ଆସେ, ଆମ ସାମ୍ନାରେ ମାଦଳ ବଜାନ୍ତି, ସେମାନେ ନୃତ୍ୟ କରନ୍ତି। ଠିକ ତେରା ଯେତେବେଳକୁ ନୈବେଦ୍ୟ ଆରମ୍ଭ ହୁଏ, ମହାପ୍ରଭୁକାରୀ ଖାଲି ଦକ୍ଷିଣ ଭାଗରେ
Beyond the hall of dance and the assembly hall lies the inner sanctum. This is the worshipper's school, where the divine presence is recognized. Here the food offering was made during the morning ritual. At night, the Mahari sang at the threshold. In Hindu metaphysics, the temple plant represented a microcosm of the world order. Outside the inner sanctum lay the world of nature. The divine presence was male, Purusha. Nature was female, Prakriti. Early thinkers said, nature, or Prakriti, danced for the divine presence. Shakti was one of the group of Maharis who took turns dancing in the morning ritual. On her way to perform, she would fast and bathe, then approach the temple, bathe in a special shawl that was tied round her waist when she danced. Inside the temple, the Mahari performed only pure dance, which had no storyline, but was said to embody the quality of Shringar, or love. Expressive dancers, called Abhinay, that enact the drama of a song, were performed for festival occasions, often in the company of other Maharis.
ସେମାନଙ୍କର ସବୁ ନିମନ୍ତ୍ରଣ ପାଇ କେତେ କେତେ ଟଙ୍କା ବି ମଧ୍ୟ ଖର୍ଚ୍ଚ, ରାଜା ବି ମଧ୍ୟ ସେଇଟା ଶାଢୀ ବି ମଧ୍ୟ ଲୋକଙ୍କୁ ଦେଇ ଜଗନ୍ନାଥଙ୍କର ଶାଢୀ ଆସି ମୁଣ୍ଡରେ ପୁରା କେବେ ଯାଇକି ତା ଭିତରେ ଦେଇ ପ୍ରବେଶ ଆଉ ଦେବଦାସୀ ହେଇକି ମଧ୍ୟ ଆମେ ବି ମଧ୍ୟ ଖାଦ୍ୟରେ ବି ମଧ୍ୟ ବାଳକ କୂଳରେ ମଧ୍ୟ କନ୍ୟା ବାଳକ କନ୍ୟା କାଳ ହେଇକି ମଧ୍ୟ ତା କରିନାହୁଁ।
This main ritual of the day that transforms prasad into Mahaprasad and that is witnessed by the greatest numbers of pilgrims takes place between the two food offerings, the 5 M's in the Garbhagriha and the food for the pilgrim in the Bhogamanapa on the left of the Mahari and on the right of the Mahari, respectively. It was not captured, the saying that I was hoping to capture of Rajguru said basically, a main branch of our ritual in Jagannath Temple has been cut. And he referred to the to the main dance during the meal offering. And that is why, he continued, that is why our rituals are no longer efficacious. They no longer give fruits. So it's a very sad statement, but it was a true statement that he uttered. And it's the end, and now it's the real end, because all of the Maharis with whom I worked are now dead. So this is the end of a millenarium tradition, and I mourn its passing. It lives now as an art form called Odissi, and Odissi is being taught mostly and was created by Gotipuas, those who used to be Gotipuas, that is, male dancers dressed as female, except their form of dress is different from that of the Mahari. You saw Sashimani, she wraps the sari around her as a skirt, whereas the Gotipuas pass the sari between their legs. So there's no possibility of Shakti Uchista, the leaving of the Shakti falling on the ground. So the dance form comes from the Gotipuas, who were young males, and they are the ones who created Odissi as a art form on the stage. And this is where it lives today. It no longer lives as a sacred ritual. Thank you. I think I will stop here and pass it to Dr. Shriya Patnaik.
Thank you so much. Hello and namaskar, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this enriching event, and it is my privilege to be here with all of you today virtually. This part of my talk is a section of my doctoral research, which has been supervised in large part by Professor Marglin. And at the outset, I would like to mention that my project could not have been completed without the pioneering study of Professor Marglin on this ancient institution, which was on the vestiges of rapid decline at the time of her fieldwork in the 1970s and 1980s, and subsequently died out at the time of my research in 2021. So my research explores how, under the colonial disciplining of deviant sexualities, together with post-colonial legislations, Devadasis were classified, categorized, conceptualized, and criminalized as religious prostitutes under contagious disease and prostitution regulations from the late 19th century onwards. However, the abolition of this tradition, instead of improving women's life circumstances, propelled a turn towards unskilled jobs in the informal sectors across India, owing to Devadasi's growing socioeconomic marginalization in the modern Indian nation state and lack of employment options in the market economy. Consequently, upon the extinction of the Devadasi community in Odisha in 2021, I argue that my interviews with the last surviving Maharis, Sashimani and Parasmani, epitomize important catalysts of social and cultural change. And I argue how such experiential accounts from the margins underscore mutating modalities of collective memory and popular culture in departing from hegemonic state-centric discourses on the Devadasi custom along linear lines of prostitution or trafficking. At the outset, I wish to make a point on my methodological approach as is shown on this slide. This is a work in historical anthropology as well as a multi-sited ethnography, reliant on sources from 11 archives across New Delhi, Odisha, London, Geneva, the Heidelberg Odisha Research Project, and finally interviews with Sashimani and Parasmani, along with regional interlocutors. So in the slide here, the first image is of the Mahari Sashimani. The second image is me with the notable Odissi dancer Ilyana Saturisti at her dance school in Bhubaneswar, who has learned from Maharis. And the third is yours truly at the Raj Nivas in Puri, which is the residential quarters of the Puri Gajapati King Digbya Singh Deb, who Professor Marglin also showed, and who is the current titular chairman of the Jagannath Temple Management Trust. So my research explores and argues how, although colonial legal political frameworks were adopted by the post-colonial structures of the independent nation state, official top-down frameworks in Devadasi abolition precluded an incorporation of the voices and experiential accounts of Devadasis who were predominantly conceptualized through exclusionary parameters of prostitution, deviance, crime, and moral turpitude in modern India. So with that, I'll go into some background to the topic. So before the passage of colonial reforms in British India circa the 1860s onwards, vis-a-vis the Contagious Diseases Acts, Devadasi abolitionist laws, and legislative acts towards governmental divestments in the management of Hindu temples, the hereditary community of ritual dancers categorized under the umbrella term of Devadasis performed religious services in Hindu temples like performative song, dance rituals, as well as the many other rituals that Professor Marglin talks about. They were socially not bound to the institution of marriage in being wed to Hindu deities in their practices of religiosity. On their regional heterogeneities, Devadasis form local communities known by different names in different areas. For example, Maharis in Odisha, Jogatis or Basavis in Karnataka, Theravadiyas in Tamil Nadu, Natis in Assam, Matangis or Muralis in Maharashtra, Bhavans or Kalavans in the Konkan region, and Bogams in Andhra Pradesh. In their matrifocal kinship structures, these women were not married to mortals but wed to gods in temples. And their performative rituals have historically constituted the Indian classical dance forms such as Bharatanatyam, Odissi, Kuchipudi, and Satriya. In particularly, the Maharis of the Jagannath Temple intrinsically differed in their ritualistic traditions, sociocultural customs, and kinship ties from other regional variants of temple dancer communities. One being in terms of their caste-selective practices, because as studied by Professor Marglin, Maharis could only be dedicated from the Pani Deba Jati, that is the water-giving caste, and they became casteless upon being dedicated. In addition, Maharis were historically respected cultural figures who enjoyed religious and royal patronage. They received a maintenance allowance from temple funds and held ancestral properties in Orissa called inams, which were later confiscated into the revenue estates of the modern nation state. Thus, against the backdrop of a conservative nexus of family values in traditional patriarchal households, whereby women's roles were confined to domesticity and motherhood, Maharis exercised greater relative access to the public sphere, historically denied to most Hindu married women. As Maharis were situated outside the heteronormative framework of conjugal matrimony, some women had patrons or partners who contributed towards them financially or in the form of gifts. However, their social status was not defined as quote-unquote religious prostitutes, as done in official discourses from the colonial period onwards, but rather as female priests, dancers, teachers, musicians, or courtesans. This was echoed to me in my interviews with the Mahari Parasmani, who reiterated that these women did not need to engage in sexual commerce out of an economic need, as they were financially compensated for their seva, that is ritualistic services, via allowances, landed estates, along with daily food in the form of Mahaprasad Bhoga, that is sacred food offerings. In my conversations with Sashimani during fieldwork, she further alluded to the strict rules of purity guiding their quotidian practices and relationships within the temple's rules. The term Dusita Bebharo in Odia refers to the attached stigma of prostitution amidst Devadasis. In their observed code of conduct, once classified as dusita, that is impure and polluted by engaging in sex work, women were no longer allowed to participate in rituals and extricated from the temple's political economy. And this ties into the point Professor Marglin was making about the Rajguru accompanying the Mahari on the day of the Seba with the Suna Beta, and also she was accompanied by Amina Nayak to make sure that they adhered to their code of conduct. Sashimani's statement in our interviews, quote unquote, Guriya akhi amku jogi chanti taki ame dusita na ho, is particularly enlightening. This translates from Odia into, quote, there are many watchful eyes over our code of conduct so that we do not become polluted in the public eye, unquote. Sashimani discussed two such women who were excommunicated from the temple's servitor community for engaging in sexual commerce. Sashimani also spoke of her relationships not along typified paradigms of deviance or prostitution and as done in official accounts, but more along lines of ashas and abhilashas, which roughly translates into English as aspects of hopes, desires, and affect in terms of affectual interpersonal relationships. Similarly, another example is that of the Mahari Parasmani, who was briefly excommunicated from the temple servitor community for a few years, because of certain prohibited relationships under the temple's record of rights. In this case, she had a long-term relationship with a man from Calcutta, which she was re-invited back to the temple after a few years. So the agency of Maharis can thus be argued to assume a certain liminality, whereby women did exercise a choice in their nature of patrons and relationships, but to be restricted to the Puri royal family or the priestly community. This rendered onto women a circumscribed nature of autonomy to maneuver through existing patriarchal structures, albeit carving out limited public roles for themselves. The Odisha state government thereafter in 1979 had prohibited Sashimani from adopting a daughter and continuing with the custom. She sustained herself through charitable offerings by dance teachers whom she had taught Odissi to. On being questioned about the associated link with prostitution, she commented to me, quote unquote, "Mu rogi nahi mu bhogi rohichi." This translates from Oriya into quote, "I have not suffered but experienced the joys of life," unquote. These words allude to a differential standpoint of female autonomy and societal acceptance, deviating from official accounts. Take, for example, another translated quote from Sashimani, quote, "I have never brought shame to Jagannath. He is my eternal husband. This is our way of life. I have had relations with mortal men. But when did virtues of love, friendship, and bodily contact become a criminal offense? These men did not sustain me financially. I owned lands until they were confiscated by the state. I received a maintenance allowance from the temple. I am not a kept woman. Maithuna, that is the Sanskrit term for sexual union in the Panchamakara rituals of Hindu Shakta and Tantric worship, is part of the human experience. This does not make me a criminal," unquote. Furthermore, although the last surviving Maharis like Sashimani, Parasmani, Harapriya, and Kokalaprabha lived on the fringes of civil society in post-colonial India, Sashimani spoke of the prestige and affluence she enjoyed in pre-colonial Odisha society during her formative years of temple association. Parasmani further critiqued the ideal of conjugal matrimony as the sole determinant of heterosocial relationships. This patriarchal vision of feminine respectability being articulated in colonial and post-colonial women's reform projects. Parasmani narrated how, as artists, their non-conjugal relationships helped bring sensuality to their music and dance rituals. I further study how a collective identity of Mahari subversion and resistance is revealed through songs that were sung in mathas, translating to monasteries in independent India. These mathas in Puri emerged as centers of mobilization and reintegration for these women post their disassociation from the temple in the aftermath of nationwide Devadasi abolitionist laws. Sashimani sang for me a few of these songs. At this juncture, it is therefore fitting to turn to one such translated song, which Sashimani sang to me during our interviews, as highlighted on the next slide. Similarly, let us look at another such poetic performative composition narrated to me by the Mahari Parasmani. Like Sashimani, whose song is on the slide, integrating a combination of facial expressions and singing, these performances were in parody form, mocking married women for their domestic pursuits. Parasmani sang for me a few of these lines, combining satirical expressions with performative gestures and singing aloud in her melodious voice in Oriya. Quote, "Kon ei bhadra gruhini mahila ଘରେ ରହି ରହି ଥକି ଯାଉନାହାନ୍ତି କେତେ ଘର କାମ କରିବେ କେତେ ରୋଷେଇ କରିବେ କେତେ ପତିବ୍ରତା ନିଭେଇବେ ତାଙ୍କର ନିଜର ବି କିଛି ପରିଚୟ ଅଛି କି ନାହିଁ ଆଉ ଏଇ ଭଦ୍ର ମହିଳା ଏବେ ଏଇ ଅଳସୁଆ ଜୀବନ ଆମ ଉପରେ ଥୋପିବାକୁ ଚାହୁଛନ୍ତି ଆହା ଏଇଟା କେତେ ଲାଜର କଥା," unquote. This translates into English as, quote, "Don't these respectable housewives get tired sitting at home? How much housework, how much cooking, how much wifely duty can they do? Do they have an identity of their own or not? And these respectable women now want to rub off their laziness on us. Oh my, what a matter of shame," unquote. While I was initially somewhat bemused at the sardonic performance back then, the profound depth of its message now stands out to me. Parasmani's derision for the life of a domesticated upper caste housewife, along with the respectable ideologies it came with, now becomes increasingly apparent to me. Moreover, her terminology of laziness, while not accurate in encapsulating the lifestyles of domesticated women, is nonetheless a fitting example of the manner in which Maharis construed married women and their domesticated lives. Performances such as these, I argue, also played a crucial role in strengthening bonds of community solidarity amidst Maharis. Specifically designed for intimate gatherings within the Mahari community in Mothos, they offered an emotive outlet for self-expression, allowing women to share their interrelated experiences and frustrations. During such internal gatherings at Mothos, Maharis would come together in an internal setting, sharing laughter and stories while enjoying their performed recitals among themselves. This environment fostered a sense of camaraderie, creating connections among them that transcended religiosity or mere entertainment. In stark contrast to their temple rituals, which were performed for broader audiences and such as the kinds Professor Marglin spoke about, these intimate performances were crafted solely for their internal community. They served as a testament to shared acts of performative defiance, allowing women to reclaim their voice in some manner, alongside underscoring their collective resilience in the face of systemic and structural forms of violence. Such factors are indicative of how a collective vocabulary of adaptation, resistance, and subversive agency emerges through such songs and performances that Maharis performed during communal events of gathering. Such occluded voices remain unrecorded in official documents and humanitarian frameworks on Maharis. Additionally, as examined by feminist scholars like Veena Talwar Oldenburg, Urvashi Bhutalia, Ritu Menon, and Veena Das, in conditions of structural violence, the recollection of such suppressed voices can also serve functions of catharsis and emotional unburdening, primarily for historically underrepresented groups. Now, this slide shows some photos of temple festivals in Puri, where Maharis historically performed rituals. These images have been clicked during recent fieldwork trips during festivals like the Ratha Jatra, Jurala Jatra, and Chandan Jatra. Now, if you look at some of these images, you will observe how ritualistic services that have historically been performed by female temple servitors are now being performed by pondas, that is, male temple servitors, thereby depicting the altered, appropriated patriarchal climate of the temple in the contemporary period. I also find it worth mentioning at this stage that historically, out of the 36 categories of temple sebaks in the Jagannath Temple, Maharis were the only female category of temple sebaks, like Rajguru talked about. Therefore, with the abolition of this tradition in the modern period and the removal of Maharis from temple services, we see the institutional erasure of all women temple sebaks from the mandira. Thus, what was earlier revered and celebrated as Chalanti Devi, that is the feminine divine force vis-a-vis the presence of these women in the temple, today no longer exists. And that, like Professor Marglin says, is a very sad development. I now want to move on to say that this topic is of particular significance in the present times, as in 2015 and 2021, the last Maharis, Sashimani and Parasmani, respectively passed away. Media channels presented this as a defining historical moment, the extinction of an age-old community that had died due to the passage of archaic patriarchal laws. While their dance rituals have been immortalized in performative culture through the classical dance Odissi, now performed in several local, national, and international stages, the inventors of this art have been in gradual decline since the colonial period. In the aftermath of this community's demise, we can now start to see increasingly romanticized and positivist depictions of Maharis, such as these, which can also be problematic in glossing over the dark periods of marginalization and stigmatization these women have historically encountered. However, drawing on transnational feminist movements, the 21st century has concomitantly witnessed regional resistance movements to advocate for equal citizenship rights of this community. In the transition from the colonial to the post-colonial, although the patriarchal framework of Devadasi laws has remained intact, popular culture and public memory about this community has drastically changed today. Mahari identity in recent moments of solidarity constitutes an expansive transnational collective, including Odissi dance professionals, social workers, human rights activists, and legal advocates, which epitomize mutating modes of collective memory and popular culture. And finally, I want to say how this case study also explicates how, in this globalizing world order, Sources of visual and performative culture constitute powerful information channels that transgress the hegemonic narratives of nation states and can be used by subaltern actors to reclaim citizenship. Take, for example, the La Bayadere ballet performed in theaters across the world. As shown on the slide, this revolves around the life of a temple dancer and incorporates elements of classical dance into ballet techniques. So, in conclusion, I argue that such factors underscore the role of what Arjun Upadhyay terms as quote unquote global cultural flows vis-a-vis surrounding indigenous struggles within the ambit of global cultural discourses through networks like mediascapes, that is, media representations shaping ways of understanding the world, technoscapes, that is, cultural iterations informed through technological infrastructures, and ideoscapes, that is, global flows of ideologies. And such channels prove quintessential towards understanding an emergent feminist and subaltern consciousness. However, I must mention that there needs to be some caution exercised in such ballet depictions of Devadasi communities, as they can in some manner succumb to a sort of Eurocentrism in historical analysis, as established by the works of the Subaltern Studies Collective, along theoretical parameters of exclusions, reductionism, and essentialism in subject representation. So to end, I would like to say how, in my presentation, through a critical examination of the politics of disenfranchisement for Mahari Devadasis across colonial and post-colonial India, while juxtaposed with insider insights from the community, we hope that this research contributes to more inclusive understandings of Devadasis across India, Maharis regionally in Odisha, along with transnational discourses on gender, sexuality, and subalternity, along with women's activist movements in the global south. Thank you.
Nothing like this shared so far in the last 4 days. So while we are at the end of our time and we have to go visit the temple, some of us are scheduled to go into the temple for a last darshan. Our gratitude to both of you for giving us a new perspective. We will walk into the temple, imagine what it must have been like when the Devadasis were dancing there. And if there is any one comment or question for our speakers, we could take that.
Question, if you have a time, it's to Professor Marglin. This main ritual that has been abolished is we know why this has been abolished. The main reason for abolishing this ritual, is it known?
The main reason is that it's really the British gaze, the European gaze on this this tradition, and that it saw it as a form of prostitution. They called it sacred prostitution. And I had to write the Encyclopedia of Religion under Mircea Eliade, and I refused to write under that title. I changed it to Hierodouleia, which is Greek for sacred female servant. And that's what these women are. But the gaze of them as prostitute is very ancient in the West. It harks back to the first temple in Jerusalem that had a similar institution, but a group of male priests called them prostitutes. And that killed it, and that was the British gaze. And it was internalized by the Indian elites that legislated against it. So they were not prostitutes, as Shriya made that very clear. They had lands. They were sustained by the temple. They didn't need. And Kokila Prabha has a very, in her house where I learned, I asked her to teach me her dance, herself and a man, stiffly seated, said, and I said, who is he? And she said, it's a friend. And one day she took me to him and his family. And he was surrounded by his sons, daughters-in-law, his wife. He was a very old man. And she still gave him pan every day. He would not take pan from any other hand than hers. So these were absolutely accepted, necessary, and I want to emphasize that. I try to do it through the painting of Risha Shringar, that the sexual behavior of the Maharis was essential. It was
Yes.
essential. They had to have, within a certain bounds, with priests and servants in the temple and not outside. But it was totally accepted when Kokila took me to her friend. I noticed what was obvious. It was totally accepted. There's no days.
I think though at that moment there was a shock of mentality between the British Puritanism, and at that time this sexuality was a reflection of the spirituality of India, which is union with the divine.
Yes.
So this could not be understood. And what happens is that people project their own sin. I mean, Devadaris doesn't have any sin inside. So sexuality was, I think, expression of Shakti, and they were so much aware of that. They were just being the Shakti energy of the universe. So it's really sad, and it's so beautiful that you brought it, and with so much information about the temple. I am really amazed by both of your presentation. Thank you so much.